BSides DC 2017 videos are brought to you by Threat Quotient, introducing the industry's first threat intelligence platform designed to enable threat operations and management, and Data Tribe, a new kind of startup studio co-building the next generation of commercial cybersecurity, analytics, and big data product companies.
My name's Brandon Arvanaghi. This mic picks up really well, so I'm going to stand back a little bit. But welcome to Beyond the Domain. This is a higher level talk about some interesting places you can find some information on red teams. And I'm going to dive into a tool I created called Session Gopher as well, which helps you find segmented hosts, jump box, and Unix systems as well. So a little about myself. I'm an associate consultant at Mandiant, which is a subsidiary of FireEye. I'm actually from Northern Virginia originally. I went to the Potomac School in McLean, Virginia, and I then moved to Alexandria, Virginia. But right now I'm actually based out of New York. At Mandiant, I've been doing a lot of tool developing, some red teaming, and in general I like to program. And I went to Vanderbilt University and studied computer science and economics there. Also, I'd like to mention that I'm here hiring. I love coming to these community events, these security organizations. Whether you're super skilled and technical, or you're eager to learn and hungry, I firmly believe in my referral bonus that I get. So by all means, thank you. So you may think it's the same if you talk to any Mandiant employee and they refer you. It's not. You should come to me instead. Just come on up. Seriously, after the talk, come on up, and I'm happy to talk to you all, take your resume, that kind of thing. So let's start with open source intelligence gathering. SPF records stand for Sender Policy Framework records, and they're actually part of the text record in DNS servers. And as an attacker, these can actually give some insight as to what services the company is using. So what it does is, if I want a different company to send emails on my behalf, this article right here talks about LinkedIn allowing DocuSign to send emails on behalf of LinkedIn, then I have to authorize them in my SPF record for my company, for my servers. So I would explicitly say in my SPF record, okay, I'm allowing, if you see an email from LinkedIn but it's actually from DocuSign, it's allowed because I gave them authority to do that. Now what that does for us as attackers, if I'm attacking LinkedIn and I look for their SPF records, I see who they've authorized to send emails on their behalf. And what that means is that I know DocuSign is now one of the companies that they use as a service, essentially. They're using that for their document management. Knowing that presents some really interesting phishing opportunities. I could say I'm from DocuSign and send it to an internal LinkedIn employee, and they might believe, hey, this is actually one of the services we use. I must have forgotten to change my password or whatever the situation is. And right here is a text record that would show the SPF part in it. This is an example. You see the V equals SPF1, that kind of thing. It'll tell you for the site that you're attacking, essentially, who they've allowed to send emails on their behalf. Another good source of OSINT is looking at subsidiary companies. So most people, when they're targeting a company, they look at the IP addresses associated with that company. So they'll go to bgp.he.net or aaron.net, and they'll look up IP ranges that are owned by the company. But a lot of times the weakest link is actually one of their subsidiaries. Huge organizations have tons and tons of subsidiary companies, and often these subsidiaries don't have the infrastructure that the parent company has. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the technical prowess, so they might actually be the softest source of entry. So there's a really cool way to kind of enumerate these subsidiaries. A lot of these public companies, well, they have to submit files to the SEC. And one of these files is called a Form 10K. Is anyone familiar with the Form 10K? Great. So within that is a section, I guess, called Exhibit 21. And within that, you can see the subsidiaries. This is for Pepsi, as an example. If you click on this, it will enumerate every single subsidiary that they have. And this is publicly available. You go to sec.gov, you just Google Pepsi subsidiaries, this will come up. And you'll list them all just like this. Frankly, if I was going after Pepsi for an engagement, I might start at one of these subsidiaries. Because they're watching like a hawk on their corporate servers, their corporate networks. So subsidiaries might actually be good ways. And on my engagements at Mandiant, we always look at the Exhibit 21 filings. Who here has played with Eyewitness before? Right? It's a great tool. So my colleague and friend Chris Trunster wrote it. What it does, after you get your ranges of IP addresses that you want to target, say you get a bunch of subsidiary companies, you find their IP ranges, you get related networks, etc. You can do an Nmap scan across all of them, find out what web ports are open, 80 and 443, and normally this is a ton for big companies. If you run Eyewitness, you feed in that Nmap output to Eyewitness, it'll take a screenshot of every single port 80 and 443 open, and any other port you provide it. Not only that, it'll tell you if there are default credentials that are typically used with that kind of thing. So if it finds an Apache server with an admin interface exposed, it'll say these are default Apache credentials. And you can just go through like this image here. It's a really clean interface. You see the source site, you see the screenshot, you see any default credentials associated with it. It's a great way to synthesize data. It's called Eyewitness. Another kind of clever source of intel when I'm on the red teams to find information about the company and how to move laterally is through chat logs. Now, a lot of chat logs are not formalized by the company. They might use a third party just randomly. They might have their own internal chat that everyone uses. It could be proprietary, sure. But these chats always log somewhere, right? To see that history, it's logged somewhere. And rest in peace to AIM. I was a big fan of that. But these logs, people are always talking about sensitive information there, just like in emails, but this is more readily available. If someone says, hey, can you reset my password quickly? This was my old password. Or, hey, what server do I need to connect to get this resource? This always takes place in chat. Think of your own companies. This probably happens. And we can go through an example. So Skype, for example, it logs, the chat history is stored in a database file. And these are the different sources for it on Windows, Macs, and Linux. And we can actually go through in this main database, main.db file, and see some of the messages. So I pulled this up on my Mac, and I just opened it up in SQLite browser, right? These are the tables that come in that main.db file. There's all sorts of interesting stuff. So you have messages there. That'll tell you the content of the messages, contacts, participants in chats, really, really good stuff. So if we actually break out into messages, we'll see what the structure of this looks like. So this is what I do on a red team. I'd go and I'd extract that file, I'd put it in a SQLite database, and I'll see these Adele lyrics coming up. And you could read through and search for things like password or interesting strings, anything like that. This one right here says, come over, my parents aren't home. I don't know. Should we click on it? If we click on it, we'll see the full body. If you guys want to click, that's fine. We'll do that. You shouldn't have clicked on it. It's Chris Hansen with Dateline NBC. Help desk and intranet. So every company typically has a help desk or intranet site. And it's normally just on a server without any kind of segregation. It's just a port that's running open on the network. So if I plugged into any specific company in a jack on the wall, I can see this server. I can interact with it. And the issue is that there's lots of useful information on these. As red teamers, we try to dig for information and get it in every corner. This site tells us the information without us asking. It's amazing. On our real engagements, we've had instances of finding password files there intentionally, saying if you need to log on to the point of sale servers, here are the credentials for that. It'll tell you network diagrams, all sorts of stuff. And these sites are often either, they don't require authentication, or when they do, they're not segmented. And what that means is that if you're a salesperson or you're a marketer, you can look up PCI information and network diagrams all day because they're not divided based on access rules or anything like that. Literally on every single one of my engagements, I have tried to search for keywords like PCI, network diagram on an intranet site like this. This is just an example. And I've gotten really good information every time. I type in PCI, I see where the PCI environment is. And this is often a goal we establish for ourselves as red teamers trying to find the credit card information. Now let's talk about separate accounts. And I want to give a little disclaimer here that this is virtually never in scope to go after personal accounts for people organizations you're targeting. But if you find yourself on an engagement where that is in scope for like a small company, a startup, this is kind of an approach. So startups and small companies, in my experience, have been the hardest targets. First of all, they have a very limited attack surface. They have one website maybe, they host it on the cloud somewhere, and phishing them is a nightmare because it's 10 people in a room. When they get an email, they say to the other people, did you send this? No? Okay, it's phishing. So how do you actually, if you are just given the attack surface of the company itself, you might not have a lot of luck. But these individuals have all sorts of opportunities to go after them. They have a ton of accounts not related to their company's website, their company accounts. Again, this is never in scope on a real engagement, but for smaller engagements, it might be. So targeting the employees is where that would come into effect. This is what a real bad attacker would do. There's a site called namecheck.com. Has anyone heard of this? Name, CHK, one back there. Okay. So it's actually a kind of interesting tool. It's a way to find available usernames online. And people like to have the same handle, like us, weirdos. We have the hacker handles that we use across every site. We try to make it the same everywhere for branding purposes, right? This site tells you where the username is available, and therefore it also tells you where it's not available. And if someone has a name that nobody else would use, you'll know where it's taken already. So I'll give you an example. This is the name check interface when you go on there. It does domains, it does usernames, and it goes down. I mean, this is truncated, but usernames goes way down. So if you type in Covfefe, for example, you see how the internet, they scurried like rats to get every kind of username. And I don't know what they're doing with this. Like, there's a Pinterest account with the Covfefe. But these are all the ones that have been taken. So if I'm a bad person, and I look for a specific handle that I know that the employee has, I'll know that they have an account here, here, and here. If there's password reuse anywhere, they're in deep trouble. Because if I find it for one place, I'm going to find it for a lot of other places. And that allows me to move kind of like Spider-Man from one account to the other until I get into their corporate account. And this is the kind of thing where breaches come into effect. There are all sorts of open source password breach dumps online for the LinkedIn breach, all sorts of different services. So if you find that username is in effect, is taken somewhere, and you find that password breach, you can test it there and then move across to other accounts that they have. This enumerates that for you. Now let's talk about Outlook and Office 365. This is kind of a clever way. If you don't have physical access or a beacon into the environment you're targeting, but you have credentials and you know that they have an Office 365 server, then you can actually get in with a cool tool called Ruler. Have you all heard of that? Anyone heard of Ruler? Got a couple people? Okay. I'll talk about that in a second. But Office 365, especially in Outlook, right? It has the global address list, which is a really wonderful source of information. So if you have credentials and you can authenticate to their Office 365, their Exchange instance, you'll get names, titles, phone numbers, organizational structure of everyone in that organization, essentially. It's whatever their IT staff puts in. But the hierarchy of every employee. You know where they're situated, their phone number, their boss, everything. I mean, it's you talk about spear phishing, this is honestly phishing with dynamite afterwards. If you can't get in after getting this information, you have a problem. You should be able to get in with this kind of information. And that's happened for us. So in previous engagements, I've had breach data, so passwords and credentials from public breaches. We've been able to go in through to get their global address list, and we use that information as a vector to get into the company again. So we just use their email address to get the information about every single person in the company, and then we sent targeted emails to those other individuals we were targeting. And all this information makes us very happy. I had to add that one, I'm sorry. So here's Ruler that I was talking about. Ruler is also a good way to kind of eliminate the middleman and use Office 365 access to execute code on the system that you're targeting. Essentially, it allows you to run code on the underlying system. So if they open up their Outlook application on their system, Ruler can inject some malicious code into that system just by them opening their email, essentially. And down here it says, what does it do? You can download the global address list like we just talked about, but the malicious mail rules makes it so that if you send an email with a trigger word, for example, then that trigger word will create a beacon back to your computer. It'll run malicious code. It's an amazing tool. It was released, I believe, at Troopers this year that you all should look into. So secret sharing. This is becoming a little bit more common. Some companies have secret sharing servers. So kind of like a password manager that has enterprise, password manager for enterprise. There are also secret sharing servers specifically for managing passwords on premise, on a server, and being able to share it across other users. This can be dangerous because it's centralized within your environment, and that bookmark, if someone's saving that bookmark on their computer, their Chrome history or Firefox history, it'll be the same everywhere. They're all using the same secret server internally. And a lot of times, your Active Directory credentials will work the same to access this. So if you open this up, for example, you'll be able to see, this is what the real interface would look like. It would show the password for any service that you want. It'll show you the machine, the username. And you could search something like, okay, I want credentials for mail. I want credentials for this resource, that resource. So secret servers are becoming more popular and becoming a more targeted, a better place to target on red teams as well. Proxies. So some applications that require internet access have to go through a proxy on the network, and those proxies often require credentials to get out of. So for example, some Java applications will need the credentials to that proxy to be able to ping out and download packages, etc. So IDEs often have these credentials hard-coded in the IDE. I'll give you an example in a second. So these are a couple instances on the right. You can use system proxy settings or command line JVM settings to pass in the proxy information. So basically what developers will do is they'll just put the credentials for the proxy in their IDE so that when the application is running, the JVM gets those arguments and it'll just be able to go through that proxy seamlessly. So this is a really bad screenshot in hindsight. But you can see this is IntelliJ, and there's a Java ops variable right there. And that variable is where the user would put in the username and password for the proxy they're trying to get out of. So if there's an IDE on the system that you're targeting, then you can look there for a credential for the proxy, essentially. Now I'm going to talk about the tool that I created called Session Gopher, specifically to find Unix systems and segmented networks and jump boxes. So we used to see flat networks completely, but companies have gotten better, and rightfully so, at segmenting their networks and their traffic. A lot of times there'll be a jump box you need to access to get into a PCI environment of hosts. A lot of times you can't interact with other hosts because there's things in between. And a lot of companies are adopting more Macs and Linux systems in their critical infrastructure now. It's not just Windows anymore. So the problem, we try to find these Unix systems, right? So let's talk about Unix systems first. Often on our engagements, we find that intellectual property for like fashion companies, they have that all on MacBooks. Point of sale terminals are often on Linux systems. And these are goals that we're tasked with. They task us with finding these systems. But these systems are both not Windows and not domain joined. So if they're domain joined Windows systems, it's easy to find everything. We have that down to a science. We have PowerView, we have Bloodhound. I think both are actually, Will Schroeder has done a great job doing that. But it's well documented how to find Windows systems because Active Directory's job is to tell you where they are. But how do we find Linux and Mac systems? So the current methodology that we have, we can do a couple of things. We could run nmap across, basically in the dark, right? You don't know where the system is, you're just going to point it somewhere, just run it on this subnet and hope for a Linux or Mac port to be open that you would see. You can run netstat on every Windows system that you see and see where it's communicating and if there's an obvious Mac port connected to there. Or you could do something like look in AD Explorer, look for an Active Directory group called Linux admin or Mac admin, find their host through like an SCCM server, find their Windows host, and look for clues on that box about where their Mac might be, that kind of thing. But if you notice, this is all about happenstance. This is shots in the dark, Nmap, if you're dealing with huge companies, you can't just run nmap and hope to find a host. It's like pointing the Hubble telescope in a black spot in the sky. It's a bad analogy because you actually find something if you do that. but you don't want to do, it's not effective, it's not efficient. There's a better way to go about this. And not only that, these rely on active hosts. These rely on active connections to Macs and Linux systems from Windows boxes or systems that are up currently. So we were wondering, is there a better way to find Macs and Linux systems without them being active, with a more targeted approach, a way to know for sure where they are? And we're getting closer with that. So here's our solution. HKey Users is a registry hive on Windows. And it's got persistent storage of saved session information for some remote access tools. So the users don't have to be currently logged in, but if they've logged onto that system before and they've used remote access tools like WinSCP, PuTTY, FileZilla, and they've saved the session in those tools, they get logged persistently to HKey users. So our thought process was this. The Unix systems might not be domain joined. There are often Windows systems that communicate with these systems, right? Windows systems often manage Linux and Mac systems. So there's obviously an artifact on some Windows systems on the environment that would tell us exactly where the Unix and Linux system is. And the HKey Users Hive is where that would take place. So within the HKey Users Hive is saved session information. There are remote access tools on these Windows systems that communicate to these Mac and Linux systems. That's the point. If we can look for these tools, if we can look for artifacts of these tools on Windows systems, we'll know the IP address, the username you need, and the password to access those Mac systems. We'll find them. So within this hive, I'll show you what it looks like. This is HKey users on a system. Things beginning in S1521, I believe, represent domain users who have logged onto a system before. And someone can correct me if that's wrong. I need to double check that. But when you find these hives, if you log in remotely to a system, if you log in physically, this is created for your domain account. And that just stays there. It doesn't go anywhere. So again, the idea was this. You find evidence that these tools are being run. If a computer is running WinSCP, then it's communicating with a Mac or Linux host. That's the bottom line. If there's an artifact these tools have been run on that system, then it would show you where they're connecting to, and you'll know the IP address. So if the save session exists for an SSH session or SFTP kind of thing, you can extract that session because it's persistently stored in that registry key. So specific tools, specific remote access tools to access these Macs. Let's go through them. Here are some tools. So WinSCP is a good one. That's how Windows systems a lot of times use file transfers to Mac and Linux systems. FileZilla, PuTTY. Super PuTTY is good for scripting multiple PuTTY instances. RDP in some cases RDP is really a general purpose remote access remote logon tool, but we extracted that session information as well, and VNC. So if a Windows system is communicating with a Mac or a Linux system, and they use one of these remote access tools, which they would, this is where artifacts of that tool would exist. So it would be in the SID that I pointed to earlier, the domain SID, and in their saved sessions kind of subdirectory there. So PuTTY, WinSCP, and Remote Desktop, they're all saved in the registry. But FileZilla and Super PuTTY, by default, go into a site manager or sessions.xml file, and they're just on disk. And you can change the default location, but a lot of times we see that people don't. They just keep it in that roaming FileZilla site manager.xml location. So let's talk about these save sessions. And hopefully I convince you. Do people here have experience using WinSCP, for example? Yeah, a lot of people, good. So hopefully I convince you by the end of this to put a master password on that. It's very easy to do. So this is what a WinSCP session would look like in the registry. So you go down to sessions and then session name, whichever the session name. It would have a host name there. It would have a password. That's an obfuscated string and a username. So again, you're looking for Linux and Mac systems. You find a Windows system that you think belongs to an IT person or someone who might be interacting with these systems that you're looking for on a daily basis. And you look and you find this registry key. This says they have saved WinSCP sessions. If you actually dig up that key like we did just here, you see the username associated with that session to log on to that Mac or Linux system, and the host name, the IP address, and the password. So here's the important part. The password is not encrypted by default. This long, ridiculous string is just obfuscation. There's nothing to it. You can reverse it without knowing a password. And here below it, this is where the registry key is that would tell you whether the master password is being used or not. In this case, it's all zeros, which means no. So I wrote this PowerShell tool, Session Gopher, which I'll get into a little bit more, to deobfuscate that password string that you just saw. And here's why you should really change your use a master password. The key to deobfuscate, it's not really a key, it is the host name and the username of the session concatenated together. To get the password deobfuscated, you just need the host name and the username of the session, which is in clear text, as you can see over here. And not only that, you don't even need what they are, you just need the length of them. The key is a number in the end. They just use the length of the host name and the username. So if I know the length of the host name and the IP address, and I add them together, I can decrypt. I use decrypt in quotes because it's not actually the right word. I can deobfuscate your password, and I'll get it in clear text. If you use a master password, it's actually encrypted though, so do that. So here's what the output would look like of using my tool. So it would extract the username and the host name, concatenate them together, get the length, and you can see for admin Anthony, who was the person from 2 slides ago, that jarbled up string just was super password. It deobfuscates it in PowerShell, and it'll extract all the saved session information from that key. RDP sessions, they don't store passwords, but they're stored in this registry key over here. And I'll post these slides, by the way, in case you're wondering. So RDP, if you want to know, so this actually helps a lot on our engagements with finding jump boxes. So if there's a specific network, a specific box we're trying to access, and we suspect a specific domain, for example, that we're trying to access, or a host name, and we suspect there's a box that might be able to communicate with it, then we can run Session Gopher on this box and see all of its RDP history. And if it's ever connected to that, then we know that that would serve as a jump box to get to that domain or that segregated host. So this is the key that you would get it from. It has this username hint key, which would give you the username associated with that RDP session. FileZilla, this is one of the non-registry ones. FileZilla sessions are stored in sitemanager.xml by default, and in this location by default, which again, I've rarely seen this ever moved by the user. It's just base64 encoded, the password in the file. So my tool will just, grab that base64, decode that. SuperPutty, I mentioned earlier, it's a good way to script multiple PuTTY instances at the same time. PuTTY is a client for SSH, and it has in its XML file, this is also non-registry based, an extra args parameter which you could provide a password for. So to automatically authenticate to SSH with a password, you would provide -pw and whatever the password you want. So again, if you find this artifact on that system, you'll see where the Mac is, where the Linux system is, and you'll have creds for it a lot of times. So we also built in a thorough mode for this tool. Who knows who this is? There you go. Surprise. That's Henry David Thoreau, yes. So in thorough mode, it'll search the entire file system for .ppk files and .rdp files. So PuTTY private key files are .ppk files, and they're created using something called PuTTYgen, which is kind of a one-off tool to create these keys. And then they'll have the information for the public key kind of cryptography that takes place to authenticate the private key to authenticate to a remote host if they're using that. Also RDP files. RDP files are interesting because they are both executables and you can interact with them in the hex editor. They're very nice, and I'll show you right now. So this is what .rdp file would look like. If you open it in something like Sublime Text, you'll see all the arguments that it provides. So if you saw this RDP file on your desktop, you double-clicked it, it would begin to open up an RDP session to a remote host. But within it is all the arguments that it takes, essentially. So The format is field name, type of field value. So it would be something like prompt for credential, :I for integer, :0, which means prompt for credential, and the next argument you're going to see is an integer value, and it's 0, which means no, we're not going to prompt for credential. It would either be an integer or a string. But this tool also extracts this information as well to find out what hosts are connecting to what hosts, so you can map out your network a little better. PuTTY.ppk files I just talked about earlier, so they contain private key information. These keys can either be encrypted or in plain text, and you can choose that when you generate the key in the first place. So this one here is not encrypted. You see that top bar, it says encryption none, and then the private lines is the actual private key and the MAC associated with it. And this allows for one-click PuTTY logins using a private key, obviously. So when you run in thorough mode, it'll find these files, it'll tell you the kind of encryption used, and it'll extract the key and whether it's encrypted, like I mentioned, and it'll extract the information from the RDP file as well. So this is just kind of output from running it, what it looks like. You can see the FileZilla sessions. It'll have pertinent information about the user, the password used, the host, and some of the different arguments within that FileZilla XML file that I showed you. RDP files, like I mentioned, and RDP sessions from the registry too. Now the neat thing about this is that you can run it remotely. The point is to map out the entire domain, to get an idea not just where the Windows systems are, which is very easy to do, but to find out where all of them communicate with a Mac or Linux system if they do. So you'd have a full picture of the domain. So to do that, you'd have to run this remotely. You could run it from one host and have it remote into all these other hosts and extract any saved session information it finds there. And that'll give you a mapping of the network. So it uses WMI to do so. WMI is Windows Management Instrumentation. It's generally considered very quiet to remote into other systems, but it requires local administrator on that system that you're targeting. So you can run this across the entire domain if you want. You might get locked out if you're using bad creds or something like that. So maybe limit it to a few systems at a time. WMI within PowerShell is used with the invoke WMI method command, which is really powerful. It allows you to basically script WMI calls in PowerShell, and that's what this uses. And so if you were to run this on several hosts, this is what the output would look like. It would dig on that first host that you provided, and it only found RDP sessions in this instance, but it'll give you the username and the host name. That's all it had for RDP. And it'll just keep digging through. If it had WinSCP, it would do that and deobfuscate. If it had PuTTY, etc., it would do that. So essentially, running this on the entire network, you'll find every connection possible to Mac, Linux, or to another Windows system. And to synthesize this kind of data, I added a write to CSV file flag. So basically, it'll just give you all the credentials you want in a nice little folder. Now, this tool has been integrated to a couple of sources recently, PowerShell, Empire, and CrackMap exec. Has anyone used either of those, PowerShell, Empire, on your engagements? Yeah, okay. So I'll just show you quickly. These are two popular ones, so I wanted to mention that. So in PowerShell Empire, it's very simple. Once you have your agent, you would just do use module, credentials, session gopher, and then just do run. And this is example output. It found a WinSCP session on the system with the that you have the beacon on. Angela username, Dwight Beats as an office reference. FileZilla session, it found one. It got the credentials there. And RDP sessions, Super PuTTY sessions, etc. And so here's the link on GitHub if you want to hear more about it, use it in your engagements. I recommend it, obviously. And that's it. So if you all have any questions about anything, feel free to reach out to me. That's my Twitter right there. You can follow. And thank you for your time.